Have you ever wondered what truly keeps millions anchored to 7 guys from South Korea? We see blinding lights and flawless smiles, but what happens when the stage goes dark? Is it just catchy music, or an agonizingly beautiful bond forged in blood, sweat, and tears? What hidden scars are they concealing behind their global fame? Today, we dive into the untold, gut-wrenching stories of resilience that forged an unbreakable loyalty. Welcome to 7 heartbreaking reasons why ARMY stays loyal to BTS. Number 7. RM, the weight of a leader, a silent agony. When we look at Kim Namjoon, known to the world as RM, we see the towering, eloquent, and fiercely intelligent leader of the biggest musical act on the planet. But beneath that polished exterior lies an agonizingly heavy burden that almost broke him. A story of profound loneliness and relentless pressure that most people will never truly comprehend. Imagine being just a teenager, an underground rapper going by the name Runch Randa, fighting tooth and nail for respect in an incredibly gritty, unforgiving hip-hop scene, only to be utterly and completely shunned, mocked, and betrayed by your own peers when you decide to take a leap of faith into the highly manufactured, heavily scrutinized idol industry. They ruthlessly called him a sellout. They viciously attacked his authenticity. And during those incredibly fragile early debut days around 2013, he had to swallow that bitter pill of public humiliation while desperately trying to keep a struggling, unknown group from completely falling apart under a tiny, nearly bankrupt agency called Big Hit Entertainment. Do you remember the infamous 2014 broadcast incident where underground rappers blatantly disrespected him and Suga to their faces, mocking their makeup, their music, and their life choices? Namjoon sat there, taking those brutal verbal bullets with a strained smile, internalizing the profound disrespect and simmering anger to shield his 6 younger brothers who were watching his every move for guidance. It wasn't just about making catchy music. It was about sheer survival in a cutthroat industry designed to chew up and spit out hundreds of groups a year. And Namjoon willingly became the unbreakable human shield against relentless hate comments, the cruel mocking of his appearance, and the constant, draining questioning of his worth as an artist. As BTS began its unprecedented, meteoric rise to global superstardom, breaking boundaries no one thought historically possible, an entirely new, terrifying weight was unceremoniously dropped onto his already exhausted shoulders. The agonizing burden of being the sole English speaker and the global voice of a worldwide cultural phenomenon. Have you ever truly noticed how deeply exhausted his eyes looked during those endless, back-to-back strings of Western interviews in America? While the other members could smile, react naturally in their native tongue, and rely completely on his lead, Namjoon was trapped in a relentless, high-speed mental marathon, simultaneously translating the interviewer's rapid-fire questions, formulating a culturally appropriate, witty, and eloquent response, translating that back for his members so they wouldn't feel alienated, and ensuring the entire group maintained that flawless, charismatic persona under the blinding, unforgiving glare of international media. It is a terrifyingly isolating experience to be the sole bridge between your brothers and the rest of the English-speaking world, absolutely terrified that one single mistranslated word, one slight misstep on a monumental global stage like the United Nations General Assembly or the Grammy Awards, could instantly bring the entire empire crashing down and ruin the lives of the members he swore to protect. He wasn't just a rapper or a musician anymore. He was violently thrust into the role of an impromptu diplomat, a global cultural ambassador, carrying the immense, suffocating pride and incredibly heavy expectations of an entire nation on his back, a pressure so immense and relentless it could easily crush diamonds into dust. But what happens when the blinding stage lights finally fade? The deafening, earth-shaking screams of tens of thousands of fans in legendary stadiums like Wembley or SoFi die down, and he is left entirely alone in the suffocating silence of a sterile hotel room halfway across the world. In his raw, heartbreakingly honest solo works like the masterpiece mixtape Mono and his profoundly deep album Indigo, we get an unfiltered, painful glimpse into the deeply fractured soul of a man desperately searching for Kim Namjoon, the ordinary human being. A young man who just wants to quietly look at art in an empty museum, read a book in a peaceful park, or ride his bicycle by the Han River without the crushing, inescapable weight of being RM of BTS. He has candidly confessed to feeling like a tiny, insignificant pebble on a massive beach, utterly overwhelmed by the terrifying velocity of their fame, constantly battling a vicious imposter syndrome that whispers he isn't good enough, despite writing, composing, and producing hundreds of record-breaking songs that have literally saved millions of lives around the globe. He poured his deepest, darkest insecurities into the lyrics of Reflection, heartbreakingly singing, "I wish I could love myself," echoing a profound internal emptiness that all the Billboard Awards, platinum records, and global accolades in the world couldn't easily fill. Do you remember the devastatingly emotional 2018 Mama Awards, when Jeon tearfully revealed to the entire world that they had seriously considered disbanding earlier that year because the mental and emotional toll was simply too horrific to bear? Namjoon was the absolute anchor during that terrifying, dark storm, the sturdy pillar of strength desperately holding the crumbling roof up so the others wouldn't be crushed beneath the rubble, absorbing their panic, their exhaustion, and their deepest fears while silently choking on his own unwept tears. When a very young Jungkook confessed that he only joined the agency because he thought RM was so cool, imagine the astronomical level of responsibility Namjoon felt. He essentially held the entire trajectory of this young, innocent boy's life in his hands, terrified to his core of letting him down. He is the leader who will confidently stand in front of millions and boldly declare, "Speak yourself," urging the youth of the world to find their own identities. Yet he struggles immensely in the quiet, lonely hours of the night to find his own voice amidst the deafening, toxic noise of the entertainment industry. He has willingly sacrificed his 20s, his anonymity, his fundamental right to make mistakes as a young adult, and a massive chunk of his personal identity to build and fiercely protect this untouchable legacy, bleeding his soul onto lyric sheets so that armies around the world could find a desperately needed comfort in their own darkest hours. Even as he prepared for his mandatory military enlistment, leaving behind everything he built over a decade to serve his country, his heartfelt letters to Army were filled not with his own fears of the unknown, but with deep apologies and profound gratitude, always prioritizing the fragile hearts of his fans over his own mounting anxiety. His loyalty to BTS and Army is not just a professional commitment dictated by a contract. It is an agonizing, beautiful, and deeply self-sacrificing love that demands absolutely everything he has, leaving him perpetually drained, yet relentlessly pushing forward against all insurmountable odds. Every single time he bows a perfect 90 degrees, every time his voice cracks as he looks out into the breathtaking, infinite purple ocean of Army bombs with tear-filled eyes, you are witnessing a man who has given his entire youth, his brilliant mind, and his fighting spirit to a cause so much larger than himself. A leader who swallows his own devastating fears so his members can shine brighter than the sun. If this is the excruciating, hidden reality of just being the leader, the solid rock of the group who seemingly has it all together, can you even begin to fathom the hidden torments and unimaginable sacrifices the other members have silently endured behind closed doors? What horrific physical injuries, sleepless nights, and mind-shattering mental breakdowns did they have to secretly push through to keep pace with this unstoppable, monstrous machine of global fame? And if Namjoon's silent suffering is just the tip of the iceberg at number 7, what absolutely mind-shattering, tear-jerking revelations are waiting to be uncovered as we dig deeper into the agonizing truth behind their unbreakable bond? Are you ready to see the real, bleeding scars hidden beneath the glittering gold? Or is the brutal truth of their perilous journey too heavy for your heart to bear? Number 6. Jeon, the hidden tears behind the smile, a sacrificial shadow. When we hear the iconic, joyous phrase, worldwide handsome, and see the ridiculously charming flying kisses playfully thrown by Kim Seokjin, known to the world as Jeon, it is dangerously easy to simply dismiss him as the designated visual, the carefree, light-hearted eldest brother of BTS who seems to effortlessly float through the intense pressures of global superstardom on a soft cloud of immense self-confidence and radiant positivity. However, the devastating, agonizing truth hidden carefully behind that flawless, ever-smiling face is a heartbreaking tale of relentless self-doubt, grueling physical torture, and an emotional sacrifice so profoundly deep that it often goes completely unnoticed by the casual observer. Imagine being a regular, highly ambitious college student majoring in acting at the prestigious Konkuk University, riding a bus to your daily classes with grand dreams of becoming a serious, respected actor, only to be suddenly scouted off the street purely for your striking physical appearance by a nearly bankrupt, completely unknown agency called Big Hit Entertainment. Jeon didn't know the first thing about vocal techniques, and he possessed absolutely zero background in professional dancing. He was violently thrust into a small, suffocating, intensely competitive practice room alongside seasoned, battle-hardened underground rappers like RM and Suga, and terrifyingly gifted street dance prodigies like J-Hope, suddenly finding himself starting from a place far below absolute zero. Can you even begin to fathom the soul-crushing humiliation, the biting remarks from harsh critics, and the agonizing sting of severe inferiority he must have felt during those brutal, early pre-debut days, desperately trying to keep up with members who practically breathed music while his own rigid body vehemently refused to move to the complex, high-speed hip-hop beats? While the naturally gifted members could quickly grasp the intensely difficult choreography of explosive debut songs like Danger or No More Dream, and head back to the cramped dorms for a few precious hours of sleep, Jeon was left behind in the cold, echoing practice room, staring intensely at his sweaty, exhausted reflection in the mirror at 3 a.m., aggressively repeating the exact same steps hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, his knees aching terribly, his spine screaming in sheer physical agony, and his feet covered in bleeding blisters, all just so he wouldn't become a burdensome liability to the younger brothers he was desperately trying to lead and protect. In the heavily hierarchical, deeply traditional culture of South Korea, the eldest brother, the Hyung, is typically a figure of strict, unquestioned authority who demands absolute respect and unwavering obedience from the younger members. But Jeon made a profoundly conscious, incredibly selfless, and heartbreakingly beautiful decision to completely shatter that rigid structure. He willingly chose to play the fool, to loudly crack terrible dad jokes, and to act ridiculously silly, intentionally, lowering himself and absorbing all the awkwardness just so the younger, highly stressed members could breathe easily and feel absolutely no suffocating pressure from his seniority. He essentially became the nurturing mother bird in their cramped, roach-infested, single-room dorm, secretly using his own extremely limited allowances to buy fresh groceries and cook warm, comforting meals for a painfully young, terribly homesick 15-year-old Jungkook, ensuring the growing teenagers didn't starve while they frantically chased a seemingly impossible, pipe dream of a music career. Yet, beneath that warm, deeply nurturing exterior, a massive, terrifying storm of insecurity violently raged, violently tearing at his self-esteem in the darkest, quietest hours of the night when the cameras were finally turned off. Listen closely to the devastatingly raw, emotionally shattered lyrics of his first major solo track, Awake, where he heartbreakingly confesses to the entire world, "Maybe I can never fly," openly admitting his deep-seated, agonizing belief that no matter how hard he painfully pushes his physical limits, no matter how much blood, sweat, and tears he leaves on the stage, he might simply never be as talented, as organically gifted, or as naturally extraordinary as the other 6 members flying high above him in the star-studded sky. He wasn't naturally born with a golden voice. His incredibly powerful, crystalline silver vocal tone, capable of hitting those mind-shattering, goosebump-inducing high notes in legendary tracks like Crystal Snow, Dionysus, and the emotionally devastating Epiphany, was brutally forged in the roaring fires of endless, throat-tearing practice sessions, shedding rivers of silent, frustrated tears behind closed studio doors so that he could stand proudly beside his brothers as a worthy equal. The excruciating psychological toll of constantly wearing a bright, unbreakable, cartoonish mask of pure happiness while secretly battling your own dark, internal demons was finally laid bare when he abruptly released the devastatingly sad solo song, Abyss, just hours before his own birthday, sending a massive shockwave of profound heartbreak and widespread panic through the entire global ARMY fandom. In a shockingly vulnerable, deeply personal letter to the fans, Jeon confessed that while the group had just achieved their monumental, historically unprecedented first #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 with the mega hit Dynamite, a profound, suffocating sense of intense burnout and crippling imposter syndrome had completely swallowed his soul whole, making him feel entirely unworthy of the very success he had literally broken his own body to help build from the ground up. He felt like he was drowning in a dark, suffocating, icy abyss at the very bottom of the ocean, absolutely terrified that his immense popularity was merely a fragile, temporary illusion, completely contradicting the loud, insanely confident, worldwide handsome persona he had meticulously crafted for years to entertain the masses and meticulously shield his true, fragile feelings. This is a man who literally trained himself to laugh louder, tell more jokes, and smile much brighter purely to conceal his own bone-deep exhaustion. A man who consistently pushed his own fragile mental health to the absolute brink just to ensure the fragile atmosphere within the tightly knit group remained positive during their most grueling, impossibly packed, globe-trotting world tours. When it was finally time for the group to face the inevitable, terrifying reality of mandatory military service, a dreaded, highly controversial hiatus that threatened to completely derail their entire historic career, Jeon, as the eldest, had to bravely walk first into the terrifying unknown, deliberately choosing one of the harshest, most brutally freezing frontline military training camps in Yongkyon during the dead of the bitter, unforgiving Korean winter, boldly leading the way into the freezing cold so his 6 younger brothers would know exactly what to expect when their own inevitable time came. He willingly gave up his extremely comfortable civilian life at the absolute, undeniable peak of their blinding global fame, leaving behind the deafening roar of millions of adoring fans in massive stadiums to quietly serve his country in the freezing, unforgiving mud. Yet his only prominent concern was making sure ARMY didn't cry or feel lonely in his agonizing absence, secretly recording dozens of pre-filmed videos, aptly named Message from Jeon, to comfort them while he was out there, enduring grueling, back-breaking marches, chemical gas training, and freezing sub-zero temperatures. Number 5. Suga, The Shattered Shoulder, A Symphony of Scars. When we hear the blistering, rapid-fire rap verses and witness the brutally honest, unapologetic swagger of Min Yoongi, globally celebrated as the formidable musical genius Suga, and the fiercely independent solo powerhouse August. It is almost entirely impossible to imagine the sheer, agonizing level of both physical and psychological torment he had to literally crawl through just to survive the darkest chapters of his youth. We see the multi-millionaire producer, the record-breaking artist, and the effortlessly cool superstar who casually drops chart-topping masterpieces. But behind that intensely intimidating aura lies a deeply fragile, heavily scarred soul whose journey is so profoundly heartbreaking that it is guaranteed to bring you to your knees in absolute tears. Imagine being a fiercely passionate but completely destitute teenager in Daegu, desperately clinging to a musical dream that your own family vehemently opposed, completely isolated and utterly misunderstood by the very people who were supposed to protect and support you. Yoongi didn't just experience standard poverty. He lived in a crushing, suffocating state of absolute survival, frequently forced to make the agonizing daily choice between eating a $2 bowl of cheap black bean noodles to quiet his screaming, empty stomach, or painfully walking hours back home in the freezing cold because spending that money meant he couldn't afford a simple bus fare. He relentlessly hustled in the gritty, unforgiving underground scene, pouring his bleeding heart, his literal sweat, and his very soul into producing raw beats and writing intensely emotional lyrics, only to be maliciously scammed, utterly ripped off, and left completely unpaid by shady, exploitative industry seniors who callously took advantage of his desperate, vulnerable youth. But the true, gut-wrenching tragedy, the darkest, most terrifying secret that he kept violently locked away from the world, and even his own beloved members for years, occurred during his grueling pre-debut days when the suffocating financial strain became so utterly unbearable that he was forced to take on a highly dangerous, exhausting part-time job as a motorcycle delivery boy just to pay his meager tuition fees. On one horrifying, fateful, rain-slicked day, a massive car violently collided with his fragile motorcycle at a busy intersection, violently throwing him into the cold, unforgiving asphalt and completely shattering his shoulder in a brutal, life-altering accident that should have instantly ended his musical career forever. As he lay there, completely paralyzed by blinding, nauseating physical agony, staring up at the cruel, indifferent sky, his immediate thought wasn't about seeking emergency medical help. It was a terrifying, suffocating panic that if the nearly bankrupt Big Hit Entertainment Agency found out he was severely injured, they would immediately kick him out of the debut lineup, abruptly ending the one singular dream he had sacrificed his entire existence for. Can you even begin to comprehend the sheer, horrifying mental fortitude it takes for a deeply traumatized, physically broken teenager to quietly drag his battered body back to the cramped dorm, violently bite his own tongue to muffle his screams of agonizing pain, and heavily tape up his dislocated, shattered shoulder just to force himself into the grueling, high-impact dance practices the very next morning? For almost 8 agonizingly long years, through every single explosive stage performance of Fire, every physically demanding choreography of blood, sweat, and tears, and every grueling, marathon-like world tour concert in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans, Yoongi performed with a literally broken, screaming shoulder, relying on countless, painful medical injections, sheer willpower, and an unimaginable tolerance for absolute physical torture just to avoid being a burdensome liability to his brothers. He silently swallowed his unimaginable physical agony, but the immense, suffocating psychological trauma of his deeply fractured past violently manifested in terrifying, crippling battles with severe depression, debilitating OCD, and paralyzing social anxiety, a dark, lonely mental war he bravely exposed to the world in his deeply raw, intensely vulnerable mixtape track, The Last. where he heartbreakingly confessed to sleeping on cold bathroom floors, terrified of people, and seeking psychiatric help while feeling like a literal monster was violently devouring his sanity from the inside out. Fast forward to the profoundly devastating, emotionally raw music video for his solo track, Amygdala, where he literally forced himself to violently relive every single excruciating trauma of his past, visually depicting his younger self desperately trying to save himself from a never-ending loop of agonizing pain. An artistic choice so deeply triggering and profoundly brave that it left the entire global fandom in a state of absolute, inconsolable sobbing. He had to stand on massive stadium stages and rap about immense global success while his own parents, who had desperately torn up his lyric sheets in his youth out of deep fear for his unstable future, finally attended his concert years later, causing this intensely stoic, supposedly emotionless rapper to completely break down, violently sobbing on the hard stage floor, bowing deeply to his family as years of suppressed agony, desperate validation, and profound relief flooded his fragile heart. All at once, even when the excruciating, bone-grinding pain in his shoulder finally became so completely unbearable in 2020 that he couldn't even lift a simple water bottle, forcing him to abruptly halt all promotional activities and undergo highly invasive, incredibly risky surgery. His greatest fear was never the intense, agonizing physical rehabilitation. It was the terrifying, heart-stopping nightmare that he might never be able to properly play his beloved guitar or perform on stage with his brothers ever again. Do you remember the sheer, unadulterated emotional devastation during the very final, closing night of his historic D-Day solo world tour in Seoul, when he finally performed those deeply traumatic songs live, only to completely lose his voice as he violently broke down in heavy, body-shaking tears, standing there entirely raw and beautifully vulnerable while tens of thousands of deeply moved armies passionately sang the lyrics back to him, acting as his protective, loving shield in his most emotionally fragile moment? He is a man who literally stared deep into the absolute darkest, most terrifying abyss of human suffering, who was violently chewed up and spit out by poverty, betrayal, and physical mutilation. Yet he miraculously took all of that deeply agonizing venom and beautifully alchemized it into a profound, life-saving musical sanctuary for millions of desperate, hurting youths around the globe. Every single time he deeply inhales before spitting a furiously passionate verse, every time you see that incredibly rare, genuinely bright gummy smile desperately breaking through his intensely serious facade, you are profoundly witnessing the ultimate, miraculous survival of a beautifully broken boy who violently fought the entire universe, his own physically shattered body, and his darkest mental demons just to stay right here, unconditionally anchoring BTS to the absolute, unfiltered, bleeding truth. If this staggering, tear-inducing revelation of severe physical mutilation, intense psychological warfare, and silent suffering has left you completely breathless and utterly heartbroken at number 5, how will your fragile mind possibly process the shockingly devastating, deeply hidden emotional turmoil violently waiting to completely blindside you in our next explosive point? What kind of unimaginable, suffocating pressure and terrifying internal darkness could possibly plague the very person who is internationally recognized as the absolute brightest, most unfailingly positive, and literal human sunshine of the entire group? Get ready, because the deeply unsettling, heartbreaking truth behind the brightest, most infectious smile in the world is about to plunge you into a profound emotional darkness you absolutely never saw coming. Number 4. J-Hope, the crushing weight of the sun, a smile that bleeds. When we hear the booming, endlessly energetic introduction, "I'm your hope, you're my hope, I'm J-Hope," and witnessed the literal human sunshine of BTS, Jungkook, radiating an almost blinding level of positivity and warmth. It is dangerously easy to forget that the brightest, most dazzling lights often cast the darkest, most terrifying shadows. We see the flawless, gravity-defying main dancer, the incredibly charismatic rapper, and the unfailingly cheerful mood maker who constantly sacrifices his own comfort to ensure everyone around him is smiling. But behind that beautifully crafted, seemingly impenetrable mask of pure joy lies an agonizingly heavy burden that would easily crush the spirit of any ordinary human being. Imagine being a highly respected, immensely talented underground street dancer in your hometown of Gwangju, winning prestigious battles and commanding deep respect, only to pack your bags for the terrifying, cutthroat world of Seoul with absolutely no formal training in rapping or singing, thrown into a cramped, highly competitive dormitory filled with incredibly intimidating musical prodigies. The sheer, suffocating pressure to suddenly transition from a pure hip-hop dancer to an all-rounder idol took a horrific, deeply agonizing toll on a young Hoseok, leading to one of the most heartbreaking, terrifying, and least talked about moments in BTS history. The devastating day during their grueling pre-debut era when the immense stress finally broke him, and he tearfully packed his bags to leave the group forever. Can you even begin to comprehend the immense, soul-shattering despair he must have felt in that dark moment? Believing he wasn't good enough, walking away from his agonizingly hard-fought dreams while a young, desperate Jungkook sobbed uncontrollably, violently clinging to him and begging him not to walk out the door? It was only because RM bravely marched straight into the agency's executive offices, passionately demanding that BTS absolutely could not survive without Young Hoseok, that he eventually made the incredibly painful, sacrificial choice to return, completely swallowing his massive fears because, as he heartbreakingly confessed, he simply trusted the members. But returning didn't magically erase the excruciating pain. It instantly thrust him into the terrifying, bone-crushing role of the group's unofficial dance leader, a massively stressful, thankless job where he had to meticulously break down impossibly complex choreography for members who had absolutely zero dance backgrounds, spending endless, agonizing hours in the suffocating practice room long after the official trainers had left. He relentlessly pushed his own fragile body to the absolute breaking point, enduring severe muscle tears, agonizing joint pain, and chronic, exhausting fatigue, forcefully becoming the strict, eagle-eyed disciplinarian who would carefully scrutinize every single millimeter of their formations, absorbing the heavy resentment and immense frustration of his exhausted brothers, just so they wouldn't face the brutal, unforgiving wrath of their strict instructors or the harsh, highly critical public. The terrifying, agonizingly heavy name, J-Hope, slowly transformed from a simple stage moniker into a beautiful, yet incredibly suffocating cage, demanding that he must always, without fail, be the energetic, smiling, positive anchor for the group and the fans, even on the days when his own mental health was violently spiraling into a deep, terrifying abyss of depression and profound burnout. Have you ever truly stopped to look at his eyes during those fleeting, unguarded moments backstage, when the blinding stage lights finally turn off and the massive, heavy mask of the ever-smiling Hobie drops for just a fraction of a second, revealing a man who is so deeply, bone-chillingly exhausted that he looks entirely hollowed out, utterly drained of his own life force from constantly pouring every ounce of his energy into healing others? This agonizing, deeply internal conflict between the cheerful, bright persona he was aggressively forced to portray and the dark, complex, deeply anxious human being he actually is violently exploded in his groundbreaking, shockingly raw solo album Jack in the Box, a mesmerizing, dark masterpiece that completely shattered his sunny image and exposed the deeply terrifying, shadowy depths of his tormented soul. Through intensely aggressive, desperately raw tracks like Arson and More, he heartbreakingly screamed out his profound fear of completely burning out, his intense, suffocating greed for artistic validation, and the terrifying realization that the massive, uncontrollable fire of global superstardom he had helped ignite could very well burn him alive until there was absolutely nothing left but silent, cold ashes. When he stood entirely alone on the massive, historically intimidating main stage of Lollapalooza in Chicago, boldly headlining as the very first South Korean artist in history to do so, he wasn't just performing. He was fighting a terrifying, deeply isolating mental war, having lost a dangerous amount of weight from the severe, suffocating stress of having to flawlessly carry an entire 90-minute set without the comforting, protective presence of his 6 brothers behind him to catch him if he fell. He literally starved himself, intensely practicing in a dark, heavily soundproofed room for 14 agonizing hours a day until he nearly collapsed from sheer physical and mental exhaustion, absolutely terrified to his core of disappointing the massive, expectant crowd and ruining the pristine, hard-earned legacy of BTS, proving once again that his breathtaking, flawless performances are always forged in the agonizing fires of brutal, unseen self-torture. Even as he bravely enlisted in the military, eventually taking on the intensely demanding, highly rigorous role of an elite drill instructor, he meticulously maintained that incredibly bright, reassuring smile in every single official update, actively suppressing his own intense physical exhaustion, aching joints, and undeniable fear of the unknown just to be a comforting, steady pillar of strength for millions of fiercely loyal armies who were deeply terrified of his sudden absence. He has willingly sacrificed his own personal serenity, his fundamental human right to simply be sad, tired, or angry, meticulously burying those entirely valid, heavy human emotions deep within his chest just so the magnificent, shimmering illusion of absolute hope and flawless perfection could brightly illuminate the incredibly dark, terrifying path for his beloved group. His unwavering, profoundly beautiful loyalty to this group is not merely found in the loud, energetic catchphrases or the flawlessly executed, lightning-fast dance moves. It is fiercely anchored in his agonizing, silent willingness to aggressively set his own fragile soul on fire purely to keep his members and his millions of fans perfectly warm, a profound, heartbreaking sacrifice of his own mental and emotional well-being to ensure the beautiful, fragile illusion of eternal sunshine remains completely unbroken against all impossible odds. If the horrifyingly intense, soul-crushing pressure and deeply hidden emotional suffocation of the group's brightest, most resilient sunshine has completely shattered your perception of their glamorous reality at number 4, what entirely unfathomable, mind-bendingly tragic secrets of extreme self-sabotage, agonizing perfectionism, and literal starvation are violently waiting to tear your heart wide open in the very next position on this meticulously crafted list? Could the very member who is universally revered across the entire globe for his breathtakingly delicate, angelic grace, his ethereal high notes, and his otherworldly, captivating beauty secretly be hiding a terrifying, intensely dark history of brutal physical torment, agonizing self-hatred, and nearly fatal insecurities that once dangerously threatened to permanently destroy his very life before the world ever truly got to know him? Number 3. Jimin, the angel's starving perfection, a dance on broken glass. When we witness the ethereal, almost otherworldly grace and breathtakingly delicate beauty of Park Jimin, it is incredibly easy to simply be mesmerized by his flawless pirouettes, his angelic, high-pitched vocal runs, and that intensely captivating, naturally flirtatious stage presence that effortlessly commands the attention of millions across the globe. However, carefully hidden behind the soft, squishy machi smile and the undeniably dazzling center stage charisma is a deeply terrifying, agonizingly dark history of brutal self-hatred, extreme physical starvation, and a mind-shattering, relentless perfectionism that repeatedly pushed his fragile body to the absolute brink of total collapse. Imagine being an incredibly gifted, highly praised contemporary dance prodigy, the undisputed top student in the modern dance department at the highly prestigious Busan High School of Arts, naturally accustomed to moving with fluid, emotional grace, only to pack up your entire life, move to a lonely dorm in Seoul, and have your entire identity viciously ripped apart and heavily criticized by strict idol trainers. Because his elegant, ballet-like foundation was the exact opposite of the rigid, heavily synchronized, aggressive hip-hop style that Big Hit Entertainment demanded for BTS's debut. Jimin was brutally placed on the chopping block, coming terrifyingly close to being completely kicked out of the final lineup, not just once, but a heart-stopping 8 different times, leaving him in a constant, suffocating state of sheer panic and agonizing insecurity. He was the very last member to join the group, cursed with the shortest training period, which violently ignited a desperate, deeply unhealthy obsession with proving his worth to his exhausted members, forcing him to sleep a mere 2 or 3 hours a night in a dark, cold practice room, relentlessly repeating the exact same choreography until his muscles violently seized and his lungs felt like they were literally bleeding from the inside out. But the absolute darkest, most horrifying chapter of his journey, a terrifying reality that still makes loyal armies physically nauseous to recall, occurred during the massively successful Blood, Sweat, and Tears era, a time when the pressure to look flawlessly thin and dangerously sexy completely hijacked his fragile mental state. Driven by a deeply distorted, highly toxic perception of his own body and a desperate need to maintain his position as the visually captivating center, Jimin willingly subjected himself to an excruciatingly severe, practically lethal starvation diet, surviving on literally nothing but one tiny meal a day for 10 agonizingly long days, brutally punishing his exhausted body while simultaneously enduring highly intense, physically devastating dance practices. The horrifying, deeply traumatizing result was frequent, terrifying blackouts. He would literally pass out cold during agonizingly tough rehearsals, his utterly depleted body violently shutting down from sheer starvation and exhaustion, while Jeon and the older members watched in absolute horror, desperately begging him to eat, only to be met with his incredibly stubborn, terrifyingly misguided refusal in the name of perfection. Can you even begin to comprehend the sheer, excruciating psychological torture of standing under the blinding, intensely hot stage lights in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans, executing impossibly complex contemporary acrobatics while your internal organs are screaming in sheer agony and your vision is dangerously swimming at the edges, all to maintain a flawless visual illusion that was quite literally killing you from the inside? This agonizingly toxic perfectionism didn't just aggressively target his physical appearance. It violently attacked his vocal confidence, turning every single live performance into a terrifying, high-stakes psychological war zone where a single, entirely normal, microscopic voice crack would send him violently spiraling into a dark abyss of profound self-loathing. Do you remember the deeply heartbreaking, raw documentary footage from their grueling Wings World Tour, where a physically exhausted Jimin is seen violently breaking down, sobbing uncontrollably in the dark, cramped backstage dressing room, furiously beating himself up and refusing to be comforted simply because his microphone slipped or his pitch was slightly off by a tiny fraction of a second that nobody else even noticed? He is his own absolute worst, most terrifyingly ruthless critic, a man who consistently holds himself to an impossibly flawless, godlike standard, brutally whipping his own spirit every time he falls even a millimeter short, constantly battling a vicious, deafening imposter syndrome that maliciously whispers he is completely unworthy of the deafening cheers that shake the very foundations of the massive stadiums they sell out in minutes. Yet, in a profoundly beautiful, deeply heartbreaking twist of tragic irony, the very man who is so terrifyingly cruel and unforgiving to himself is simultaneously the designated angelic comforter, the fiercely loyal emotional anchor, and the warm, healing sanctuary for every single other member of BTS. Whenever V is sobbing uncontrollably on stage, whenever Jungkook is paralyzed by exhaustion, or whenever Namjoon is buckling under the crushing weight of leadership, it is always Jimin who instantly rushes to their side, wrapping his arms tightly around their trembling bodies, silently absorbing their profound grief and heavy tears while completely ignoring his own rapidly bleeding wounds. He poured this intense, agonizing internal conflict, this terrifying duality of immense love and profound self-sabotage, into the devastatingly raw tracks of his solo masterpiece Face, explicitly revealing in the aggressive, deeply desperate lyrics of Set Me Free PT2, his exhausting, lifelong battle to break out of the highly suffocating, terrifyingly perfect idol box he had trapped himself inside, a desperate plea to finally breathe without the agonizing fear of judgment. Even when preparing for his incredibly daunting mandatory military enlistment, deliberately choosing to bravely join the highly rigorous, physically grueling artillery unit alongside his youngest brother Jungkook as a protective companion, he still prioritized masking his own deeply valid anxieties, carefully ensuring his final messages to ARMY were filled with nothing but that incredibly soft, reassuring mochi warmth, violently swallowing his own terrifying fears of the unknown so the fandom could sleep peacefully at night. His agonizing, heartbreaking loyalty to BTS is not just a simple commitment. It is an incredibly terrifying, breathtakingly beautiful dance on a floor completely covered in shattered glass, a willingness to literally starve his own body, violently crush his own insecurities, and relentlessly bleed on stage just to guarantee that the flawless, magical illusion of BTS remains perfectly intact for the millions of people who desperately rely on it to survive. If the intensely horrifying, deeply traumatizing revelation of Jimin's brutal self-starvation, mind-shattering perfectionism, and agonizing hidden tears has left your fragile heart completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces at number 3, how on earth will you possibly survive the profoundly devastating, deeply tragic emotional betrayal waiting to completely ambush you in our next point? What unspeakable, deeply hidden grief and terrifying internal isolation could possibly be tormenting the very member internationally crowned as the most handsome face in the world, the one whose incredibly deep, soulful voice acts as a warm blanket, but secretly hides an agonizingly tragic tale of profound loss and quiet desperation. Number 2. V, the Hidden Boy, A Canvas of Tears. When we gaze upon the breathtaking, globally celebrated features of Kim Taehyung, universally adored as V, it is incredibly easy to get completely lost in his deep, soulful baritone voice, his effortlessly chic fashion sense, and that devastatingly handsome, internationally crowned most handsome face in the world that seems to naturally command the unwavering attention of every single camera in the room. But hidden far beneath that meticulously styled, incredibly charismatic Gucci-clad exterior and the playful, boxy smile that instantly melts millions of hearts lies a profoundly heavy, intensely sorrowful tale of excruciating hidden grief, suffocating isolation, and a beautifully tragic, misunderstood soul that has quietly weathered some of the most devastating emotional storms in the group's entire history. Imagine being a young, incredibly innocent farm boy from the quiet, rural town of Jeon, practically raised by his beloved grandmother for 14 years, who accompanied a friend to a big-hit audition purely for moral support, only to accidentally get scouted himself and thrust into the terrifying, cutthroat idol training system in Seoul. But his agonizing entry into the group wasn't celebrated like the others. In a highly controversial, deeply agonizing marketing move by the agency, Taehyung was intentionally designated as the hidden weapon, strictly forbidden from taking pictures, filming vlogs, or interacting with the desperate, growing fanbase, while the other 6 members actively built their public profiles and bonded with their early supporters. Can you even begin to fathom the profound, bone-chilling loneliness of being a heavily restricted teenager, forced to physically hide in the dark corners of the dorm or stand entirely out of frame during group broadcasts, secretly watching his brothers laugh and connect with the world, while maliciously wondering if the agency was ultimately planning to mercilessly cut him from the final debut lineup at the very last second? That immense, agonizing trauma of feeling entirely invisible and easily replaceable violently scarred his fragile heart. Yet the absolute darkest, most utterly devastating tragedy of his entire life struck during the group's explosive blood, sweat, and tears era in 2016, a horrific emotional ambush that would permanently shatter his world into a million irreparable pieces. Right at the pinnacle of their massive breakthrough, as they were winning monumental first-place trophies on major music broadcasts and performing in front of deafening crowds, Taehyung's beloved grandmother, the absolute center of his universe, his primary parental figure, and the very reason he pushed through the brutal trainee days, suddenly passed away. The intensely suffocating, utterly inhumane cruelty of the K-pop industry dictated that the show must absolutely go on. So, a completely shattered, grieving Taehyung was violently forced to aggressively push his agonizing, soul-crushing grief deep down into his chest, meticulously applying heavy stage makeup to hide his swollen, tear-stained eyes, and putting on a bright, flawless smile to perform physically exhausting choreography on international stages while his heart was literally bleeding out inside his chest. He carried this incredibly heavy, agonizing secret all by himself for weeks, violently swallowing his own sobs in lonely hotel rooms, until he finally, completely broke down in front of tens of thousands of fans at the Gocheok Sky Dome, tears aggressively streaming down his face as he heartbreakingly confessed to the entire world that the person who loved him most couldn't even see him on television or achieve his promise of success before she tragically passed. That deeply traumatizing, excruciating pain of smiling through a violently shattered heart profoundly shaped his artistic soul, leading him to heavily channel his intense, suffocating sadness into the devastatingly raw, hauntingly beautiful lyrics of his solo tracks like Stigma, where he desperately apologizes for his own perceived sins, and Singularity, a chillingly dark, theatrical masterpiece that brilliantly visually represents the suffocating mask he is forcefully required to wear to hide his agonizing, true emotions. This profound internal isolation fiercely climaxed during the terrifying global pandemic, where Taehyung bravely confessed to experiencing a massive, deeply paralyzing burnout, feeling entirely completely empty, dangerously exhausted, and profoundly disconnected from the massive, unreachable V of BTS persona, a dark period he beautifully immortalized in the incredibly melancholic, tear-inducing ballad, Blue and Gray, agonizingly pleading for an angel to come and save him from the heavy, terrifying shadow slowly consuming his sanity. Even when he boldly took on the immensely stressful, highly demanding challenge of becoming the very first member to officially debut as an actor in the historical drama Warang, He carried the utterly terrifying, crushing weight of absolutely not wanting to ruin the pristine, hard-earned reputation of BTS, privately crying in the bathroom stalls from the immense, suffocating pressure until Jimin and the older members discovered him and assured him he didn't have to carry the burden alone. In his deeply personal, beautifully jazz-infused solo album, Layover, he completely stripped away the flashy, highly produced idol glitz to intimately reveal Kim Taehyung, the vulnerable human being, exposing a slow, deliberate, and deeply nostalgic soul who simply wants to peacefully exist outside the incredibly fast, suffocatingly toxic velocity of global fame. And when the agonizing time finally came for his mandatory military enlistment, instead of choosing a safer, easier path, this supposedly delicate, fashion-forward artist shocked the entire nation by voluntarily applying for the incredibly elite, physically brutal Special Duty Team, SDT, anti-terrorism unit, aggressively challenging his own physical limitations and intensely dangerous training environments, proving that his underlying resilience is forged in literal steel, completely shattering the massive public misconception of his fragile persona. Every single time you hear that intensely deep, velvety growl in his voice, every time you see that deeply soulful, melancholic gaze staring intensely into the camera lens, you are intimately witnessing a man who has bravely walked through the absolute darkest, most terrifying valleys of profound grief, suffocating isolation, and agonizingly quiet desperation, yet miraculously continues to fiercely offer his deeply scarred, beautifully healing heart to the millions of armies who desperately need his warm, comforting light to survive. If this breathtaking, utterly tragic revelation of unbearable grief, forced smiles during funerals, and terrifyingly deep burnout has completely paralyzed your emotional state at number 2, how will your fragile soul ever possibly survive the final, earth-shattering, tear-jerking conclusion that is aggressively waiting to brutally tear down everything you thought you knew about the youngest member of this group? What unimaginable, terrifying sacrifices, violently stolen youth, and crushing psychological torment could possibly be hiding behind the globally revered, golden boy image of the very one who practically grew up entirely under the suffocating, unforgiving spotlight, violently carrying the heaviest, most agonizing expectations of an entire generation on his heavily bruised shoulders. Number 1. Jungkook, the stolen youth, a golden cage of sacrifices. When we hear the roaring chants for the golden magne and witness the sheer, undisputed, world-dominating power of Jungkook, it is incredibly easy to be completely blinded by his flawless vocals, his explosive, gravity-defying dancing, and his seemingly superhuman ability to excel at absolutely everything he touches. However, violently concealed behind the record-breaking solo albums, the massive Calvin Klein billboards, and the breathtakingly confident center stage presence is an agonizing, profoundly tragic story of a stolen childhood, suffocating expectations, and a deeply terrifying level of psychological pressure that forcefully stripped away his entire youth before he even had the chance to understand who he truly was. Imagine being a painfully shy, incredibly introverted 13-year-old boy from Busan, so intensely terrified of strangers that he would literally wait until all the other trainees were fast asleep, just so he could quickly shower in the freezing cold dorm bathroom without being seen, silently crying himself to sleep because he missed his mother so incredibly much. He didn't just join a band. He violently threw his fragile, formative teenage years straight into the brutal, unforgiving meat grinder of the South Korean idol industry, willingly abandoning the simple, ordinary joys of going to school, hanging out with friends, experiencing first loves, or making innocent mistakes without intense public scrutiny, all to carry the incredibly heavy, terrifyingly massive expectations of a failing agency squarely on his tiny, fragile shoulders. He was crowned the Golden Magne because he was exceptionally gifted at singing, dancing, and rapping, but that dazzling, affectionate nickname quickly morphed into a terrifyingly heavy, suffocating cage of absolute perfectionism, a cruel, silent rule that dictated Jungkook is absolutely never allowed to fail, never allowed to be tired, and never allowed to show weakness because the entire foundation of BTS heavily relied on his flawless execution as the center. Can you even begin to comprehend the sheer, bone-crushing panic of being a 15-year-old kid standing on a massive debut stage, absolutely terrified to his core that if his voice cracked or his foot slipped, he would single-handedly destroy the desperate, agonizingly hard-fought dreams of the 6 older brothers who practically raised him? He didn't have a normal family life. Namjoon, Jeon, Yoongi, Hoseok, Jimin, and Taeyoung literally raised him, feeding him, buying his school uniforms, attending his entrance and graduation ceremonies like incredibly proud parents, and guiding his morals, a profoundly beautiful yet agonizingly heavy dynamic that Jungkook heartbreakingly immortalized in his devastatingly raw solo track, Begin, where he violently broke down in tears confessing to Bang PD that he has no personal hardships, no physical pain, but the absolute, most agonizing torture of his entire life is silently watching his Hyung suffer and not being able to magically fix it for them. This immense, suffocating devotion pushed his fragile physical body to terrifying, life-threatening extremes, most horrifyingly captured during the grueling Wings tour in Chile, where a severely exhausted, dangerously pale Jungkook practically collapsed backstage, violently gasping for air from a severe lack of oxygen and absolute physical depletion, his body violently trembling under the harsh medical lights. Yet when RM gently suggested he sit out the rest of the show to literally save his own life, Jungkook aggressively refused, furiously pushing through the blinding nausea and searing muscle pain to perform impossibly demanding choreography purely because he was terrified of disappointing the fans who had waited years to see him. Do you remember the sheer, unadulterated heartbreak of the 2018 London concert, where a severe heel injury violently forced the most physically active, explosive dancer of the group to sit entirely frozen on a small stool for the entire agonizingly long show? He violently sobbed uncontrollably into his hands, entirely unable to hide his profound, crushing devastation and agonizing guilt from the massive stadium, brutally torturing his own mind with the toxic belief that he had single-handedly ruined the entire concert for millions of people, completely ignoring the fact that he was severely injured and in excruciating physical pain. He grew up directly under the blinding, intensely unforgiving microscope of global fame, constantly chased by terrifying, deeply invasive satiating fans who violently stalked his every single move, stealing his private information, invading his gym sessions, relentlessly calling his private phone during his deeply vulnerable late-night live streams, and completely robbing him of the basic, fundamental human right to simply step outside his house and breathe without being aggressively hunted like a rare, exotic animal. During those incredibly intimate Weverse live broadcasts, we often saw a deeply lonely, highly vulnerable young man fighting intense insomnia, literally drinking alcohol, singing his heart out, and eventually falling fast asleep in front of millions of people simply because the virtual presence of ARMY provided the only safe, comforting sanctuary where he didn't feel entirely alone in his massive, echoing apartment. Yet, despite this deeply traumatizing, suffocating lack of privacy, he continuously, aggressively pours every single ounce of his bleeding soul into his art, writing profoundly comforting masterpieces like Magic Shop and the devastatingly beautiful Still With You, while standing alone in the pouring rain of his own thoughts and carrying the immense, historically unprecedented weight of becoming a global pop giant, with his massively successful solo album, Golden, dominating the Billboard charts and fiercely proving that the shy, crying boy from Busan has violently transformed into an unstoppable, worldwide titan. And when the highly dreaded, intensely agonizing reality of mandatory military service finally arrived, a time when he could have easily legally delayed his enlistment for several more years until he was 30 to aggressively capitalize on his massive solo success and global domination, he made the incredibly selfless, deeply heartbreaking decision to abruptly halt his booming career and enlist early alongside Jimin, willingly shaving his head and marching into the freezing, grueling artillery unit purely so the agonizing, deeply painful wait for Army would be significantly shorter, intensely prioritizing the highly anticipated 2025 group reunion over his own massive, individual glory. Every single time he deeply bows until his head practically touches the stage floor. Every single time he meticulously tattoos his entire right arm and hand with profound, permanent tributes to Army and his members, completely defying strict, highly conservative Korean societal norms and risking massive public backlash just to visually wear his bleeding heart on his sleeve. You are profoundly witnessing a man who has violently sacrificed his entire youth, his personal freedom, and his fragile peace of mind to build an unbreakable, eternal sanctuary for the millions of people who desperately look up to him. These 7 deeply scarred, beautifully broken, and immensely powerful men didn't just create catchy pop music. They violently bled, starved, shattered their own bones, battled crippling depression, and aggressively fought through the absolute darkest, most terrifying mental abysses of human suffering to forge an unbreakable, agonizingly beautiful, and fiercely loyal bond with Army, proving once and for all that this historically unprecedented, world-dominating phenomenon is not merely a passing musical trend, but a literal, life-saving revolution built on tears, extreme sacrifice, and an incredibly agonizing, fiercely protective love that will absolutely never, ever die.